I'm Joseph Haaga. You're listening to the MLOps Community Podcast, and today we're talking about ML platforms.
You know I'm in Berlin right now?
Oh, yeah?
Dude,
How's that?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say, it's not even going out on a limb, it's just, I'm going to state this hot take. Berlin is the coolest city in Europe, potentially the world. I've never been to every city in the world, so I can't really say that, nor have I been to every city in Europe, but out of all the cities that I've traveled to, Berlin has just got something special, man. Have you been here?
I haven't, but it's on my bucket list. I desperately want to go.
Yeah, it's worth it. So we just got done talking to Joseph Haaga. What'd you think?
I thought it was a great conversation. I thought that Joseph, he's leading a lot at Interos, and it was cool to see how much mastery that he had over the entirety of what they're building, which is really impressive and takes advantages of a lot of the best practices that we talk about in the community all the time. And the way that he was able to explain the blog post, talk in detail about each element of their entire platform, I was like, damn, that's really impressive. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I love how he looked at this fundamental problem of I don't want anybody to be blocked by me or by the platform. So how can we avoid that from the start? How can we make sure that we're not creating potential bottlenecks? And when they built the platform, they thought about that. He thoroughly had lots of deep thoughts on it. And then he was able to create solutions and name those solutions in funny ways. So that was awesome. And also, I should mention, him and his team, they're writing a series of blog posts that we will link to in the description. It's the Shipyard blog post. It tells all about what they're doing at Interos. And they have 3 out right now. They're about to publish the 4th. So go and read those if you want to dive deeper into this and you like this conversation. That's it for now. We should probably mention, Vishnu, before we get started, that we've got a few announcements. One is we would love to get some love from you all on Spotify and Apple. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe, hit a follow, hit like 5 stars, give us a review, all that good stuff that you can do, a like if you're watching on YouTube. And the other thing is that we just started this new Best of Slack weekly newsletter. It goes out every Thursday. So if you joined Slack a while ago and it was too overwhelming for you, we've got the curated best of threads that you can look at and get a high level of what's been happening in Slack over the last week. We'll also leave a link to that in the description below. So that's it. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Nope, that's it. Let's get to it.
Should probably start by just talking about what Interos is and tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So Interos is the operational resilience company. We build something we call the operational resilience cloud. But basically, customers, whether it's a Fortune 500 company or a federal agency or anyone in between, they onboard to our platform and we're able to actually map out their extended supply chain. Not just the companies that they do business with, but the companies they do business with, all the way out to the 5th, 6th, and tier. And that's powered by this supply chain relationship knowledge graph that we have running in our backend with over 300 million entities represented. So we're able to map out your extended supply network ecosystem. And then we also monitor a couple different real-time news feeds to identify events related to any of those companies in your supply chain. And we update, we actually score your supply chain ecosystem along 6 different risk factors, and we update those scores when those events come in. So every day you can log in and sort of see, what's happening in my extended supply universe and how did it impact, my cyber risk score? How did that impact my financial risk score or my ESG, environmental, social, governance risk score?
Wait, so you've probably got your their work cut out for you these days, considering the global supply chain that is happening right now.
Yeah, it's been a crazy space. This is my first job in this space. I've been here for probably a little over a year and a half now, and the pace has just been pretty nuts. So I'm more on the tech side, but it seems like first it was COVID and those initial supply chain impacts, and then it was kind of the long tail effects. So there's ships at the ports that have been sitting there for weeks and weeks, and there's no staff to unload them. And then it's just sort of all these things waterfalling onto each other, right? Like the conflict in Ukraine, and the impacts on sort of natural gas pipelines and just how oil gets moved around the world. So it seems like hit after hit is sort of driving home that this is a priority. And kind of as a result, we're seeing a lot of legislation as well as stuff going on the Hill, related to shoring up supply chain sort of resilience. And the government, it seems like they're going to be mandating some stuff related to that.
Wait, so what are the use cases that you're using machine learning for?
So that part where we monitor supply chains, particularly extracting events from the news and resolving them to entities in our knowledge graph, that is entirely powered by machine learning. You just can't hire enough people at the scale to monitor every event and every article that comes in every day or gets published. So you really need a solid machine learning platform and models running on top of that platform to read all the news and extract relevant events.
I see. So it's like a lot of NLP, then I would assume, and any other kind of models. Are you doing like forecasting stuff or optimization for routes, or you don't even dip your toes into that?
Forecasting is definitely on the timeline. I think route selection, it's probably on the roadmap as well if you talk to the product folks. But right now, yes, primarily NLP, as well as some sort of pseudo NLP problems. For example, Facebook has a model called Genre that actually resolves entity mentions, not just to this is an entity of type organization, but also here's the link to the Wikidata entry for this particular. So I'd say the big two are NLP for event and relationship extraction, as well as entity resolution to sort of global canonical data stores like Wikidata.
And so I think we wanted to talk today a lot about how you built the internal system and the platform that you're using, because it is quite advanced. You've got a great blog post or series of blog posts that you put out around what you're doing. Maybe we should start with the big question that everyone always asks themselves when they're starting out on this journey is, should we build? Should we buy? Should we open source? What was your decision there and why?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. And there's a book called, I'll need to look up the name of the book. It's about system architecture and sort of how do you go about designing and architecting a system. And one of the main things that it drives home is the architectural drivers, right? So not necessarily the functional requirements of what does the system need to do. Of course, those are important. But what's the context you're building the system in? So do you need to get something online today? Is cost a concern? And especially what will the system need to be able to accomplish tomorrow and next week? Not necessarily next year. You can't solve every problem up front or else you'll never build anything. But logically, once this proof of concept is finished and you've delivered value, what's the next one big thing for the next proof of concept going to be? So you have to keep that in mind. And I think as such, when we decided to build this platform sort of last December, the big thing was we have 15 or so machine learning models. They're NLP models, and they're running as bare Kubernetes deployments, right? And there are some limitations related to that. So they're wrapped in a fast API microservice, but we're not necessarily sure if it's actually using the underlying GPU node, if it's connecting properly through the CUDA layers, and also it's a little bit hard to scale for demand. Like, do we have to write in sort of a shim that allows the application, I guess allows the Kubernetes control plane to know when to scale up and down? And it seemed like there were some purpose-built kind of off-the-shelf solutions, namely Kubeflow and KF serving, now known as Kserve, that kind of solve these problems. So people in the DevOps organization sort of encouraged me to look into it and evaluate it for about a week or so and see if it solved our problems. And that's kind of the origin of the ML platform team. So it started as we have 15 models running on a regular Kubernetes cluster, try and get them running in Kubeflow using KF serving, and try and solve our scaling problem. There was a big scaling problem.
Talk to me about using Kubeflow and the experiences with that.
Man, it's been tough, but the community that works on Kubeflow is working so hard, and they've come very far in the past year in terms of documentation, the experience with installing and sort of administrating a Kubeflow cluster. I feel like I've learned a lot over the course of the year. I've seen some open source projects come and go. One was namely Argo Flow, which allows you to install Kubeflow using sort of Argo CD apps and Helm chart manifests. It seems like support has wavered a little bit on that one, but as of Kubeflow 1.4 or 1.5, they've actually got a new method of installation that doesn't involve the kfctl command line utility, and as such, it's a little bit easier to build into your platform provisioning pipeline.
Okay. So, I mean, there's so many cool tools that you all have created, but we should probably start with like this general theme that you went about creating standards and rules when you were building the platform. Can you dive into why that was and why you felt like that was so important?
Yeah, I think because the information extraction team, which is the team that actually trains, tests, and builds the NLP models, they can't stop work and wait for one guy to build, an ML platform and show them, how it's going to look like or how it's going to work. They need to keep moving forward with their projects because at the end of the day, the business needs to deliver certain things on certain timelines. So I thought the easiest way to bridge that gap so we could sort of parallelize the work is to create a set of mutually agreed upon standards. And half of these are like API contracts, or here's the modules in your Python project that we expect. You should have a serve.py. It should subclass a Tornado web server. It should have a load method and a predict method. And from there, do whatever you want. As long as it implements those methods, when you deploy it to the ML platform, it will work. And that way I could kind of decouple the development of the ML platform from the development of the models that run on the platform. And, as such, I didn't want to necessarily support up to around eight ML engineers who are all working simultaneously on different projects. I thought that would probably eat into a lot of MLOps engineer time. So we ended up building Snitch over a weekend, last May or April. And this automates sort of enforcing compliance to those model standards, right? So it uses the AST, it parses the AST to make sure that serve.py implements a subclass of the Tornado web server, and it has a load method and a predict method. It makes sure your README has links to the model weights in S3 and the data set in S3 that the model was trained on. It makes sure that you have a Docker file and it's tagged with the appropriate sort of metadata and labels so we know what version of the model is this, what's the URL of the pipeline that built this container image, things like that.
So now I'm happy you mentioned Snitch because first of all, I wanted to ask about the name. Who came up with that name and what is that about? Snitches are not always known as a good thing. So what's the story behind that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I don't quite remember the origin, but I think the idea was that it's going to rat on you and spit out a hopefully descriptive error message with exactly what you might have missed or what isn't in the model standards. So hopefully people don't view it as adversarial. It's like this damn tool keeps stopping me from deploying. But I think that was the idea. It was kind of a playful name on that concept.
The thing about Snitch that I think is interesting is it's about promoting adherence, as you said in your blog post, right? And making sure everybody is maintaining the same standards of excellence when it comes to documentation and sort of process. And I actually wonder, like, how do you deal with it? I find sometimes that it's easier to get people on board for like when it works. Like everyone will, I'm sure everyone will do it. Like the outcome's going to be great. This is going to look so, so awesome. But it's when people make mistakes that, these processes tend to fall apart. And I'm wondering how you guys deal with that. Like when people fall short and Snitch catches them, or you might say like, hey, people aren't following the process properly, one of you ML engineers, you're not following what the platform team has said. How do you handle that sort of like inter-team like discussion? I don't want to call it conflict because it might not be.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think you have to build off a foundation of, you have to have a good relationship with who we view as the users, right? So we are the MLOps engineers on the ML platform team building for ML engineers on our sister teams, basically. They're adjacent to us. We all report to the same manager. So you have to start with a good bedrock foundation of trust. It's not a malicious, oh, someone over in some other team that I've never met built this process that's either too strict or it enforces a rule that doesn't make any sense. You have to have a good relationships in place. And I think part of that is culture, right? Is it a fun workplace? Can you joke around with people? You know, are we all kind of happy to be here, and do we enjoy what we're doing every day? Once you have that bedrock of trust, you really do have to sometimes internalize error messages. It's not always pebcac. It's not always, oh, the user didn't read the documentation closely enough. Sometimes a particular rule that you're enforcing doesn't make sense, or maybe it made sense in the past or it doesn't really fit anymore. Or even if it does make sense, is the error message clear enough? Is it immediately evident to the user, right? So it kind of goes back to the idea of developer experience. Even if you are right and an ML engineer missed something and they should have it, like, why can't you make that a more pleasant experience? So it's very important to kind of take that feedback and use that to reiterate quickly and ultimately build a platform that users can stand using. Ideally, they'd actually enjoy using it and it would make them faster, because that's the goal of MLOps in my view.
Yeah, I like the way you put that because it reminds me that the customer isn't always right, but the customer matters. And you have to listen to what the customer is saying, even though their word may not be gospel. And I'm wondering if you can give us an example of something that you had to change in your, either your testing process or in your sort of development process based off the feedback of ML engineers and data scientists, sort of in this vein.
Absolutely. So the initial iteration of the platform, it's built on Kubeflow using KF serving or Kserve, and sort of out of the box, if you look at the documentation for Kserve, they recommend that you use the TF serving version 2 predict API, or maybe the version 1. And this basically dictates, here's the format for the payload when you send a request to a model, and here's the response format. But that didn't necessarily, it was a bit too vague for our use case, which again is processing news articles and extracting events and relationships from them. So the ML engineers felt very strongly, not just the people building the models, but the people building the pipeline that reads the articles and then requests predictions from the models and then consumes their results. They felt that a format that was more purpose-built, a request and response format that was designed for news articles to be have entity extraction and relationship extraction performed on them. They thought that would be ideal. And I personally was a little reluctant because all this tooling is built around sort of this standard generic request response format. And if we do decide to adopt something that helps ML engineers go faster and deliver business value faster, we as a team have to more tightly couple our code to that. One example, and this is coming up in the Shipyard part 4, is our data feedback loop. Rather than processing a single request and response format, every prediction will be in this format and we'll know how to process it with one sort of path through our code base. We're coming up with an alternative purpose-built request response format for events. But what's next? What's the next sort of request response format? Is it going to be, we have events on news articles. Are we going to start processing images and try and extract like people or public figures from those? Basically, how is this going to explode in complexity? And as a result, if our code is tightly coupled to this format and new formats get introduced, every time a new format is introduced, how many different code bases are we going to have to update? So I think that required, again, built off of a strong relationship between the users and the developers of the platform. We sort of communicated our concern, and they said, that's fine. We understand that. We'll keep you in the loop if any new formats, need to be introduced, and we'll sort of cross that bridge as we get there. But for now, it's simply, there's too much velocity we would gain by implementing this change. We should really do. And we agreed, it was mutually agreeable. Okay, this makes sense for now. We don't have to solve every problem up front. We can sort of cross that bridge when we get there.
So just so I understand, you're basically saying, hey, in Kserve, they had this sort of spec or this way that they wanted predictions to be interacted with. And your team came back to you and said, hey, we want some more flexibility because the use case of turning news articles into events, we need to preserve that flexibility in case we want to change how we approach turning those into events because we might introduce new models or new formats. And so you guys had a discussion about that and how to maintain that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that covers it. Basically, we wanted to use the generic out-of-the-box request-response format. They wanted to use one that was more purpose-built because it would allow them to go faster. We said, this works for what we're doing now. Will this work in the future? We're not so sure. But ultimately, we agreed to just give them what they needed to move fast now and solve future problems in the future.
One thing I'm wondering about is because you mentioned right now you've got 8 machine learning engineers, and you are on a different team, or you're leading this team. How does the team structure look? You've got data scientists, data engineers, I imagine, and who is doing what and where? Like, what does the composition look like, and how does the organizational structure look?
Sure. So I actually give this as a preamble during phone screens when I talk to new candidates, but we have an ML solutions department led by my boss, Hunter Powers. He has it split into 4 teams. The first team is called Relationship Discovery, and they build mostly data pipelines and heuristic models, as well as some tooling to extract relationships from the web. So semi-structured information. They parse websites and extract relationships from there and then send them to humans in the loop for annotation and review, basically to build out our supply chain relationship knowledge graph. The second team is called information extraction, and these are the data scientists and ML engineers who actually train, test, and deploy ML models. So they are given a problem from the methodology team. Say we want to identify ransomware events in the news. So they will compile a data set, pick a model architecture, train it, tweak the hyperparameters, compare a couple different model architectures maybe, but ultimately they produce a machine learning model. And then they use our tooling not only for the training, testing, building, and deploying and monitoring of that, because we are the ML platform team. And then there's a 4th team called Event Capture that actually runs this orchestration that basically reads news articles from Kafka and then sends them to all of our models for annotation, and then they sort of compile the results and produce structured pieces of data, both on a downstream Kafka topic as well as in the kind of master data lake.
That is, it strikes me that this is a really complicated product. There's a lot of surface area here for your product and for the data that you're trying to consume and the value you're trying to drive for consumers. When you joined, how did you think about that? I'm curious.
So when I joined, I was a data engineer on that first team I mentioned, actually.
Okay.
This was before we had an MLOps capability, and it was a couple months in before it sounded like, we want to build out this functionality. Would you like to give it a shot? Would you like to try building this out and seeing what you can do? So that's something I'm very grateful for, is the opportunity at a growing company to sort of stretch myself and grow into roles, kind of building out capabilities that a lot of companies still don't have. Again, it's a pretty nebulous field, even though you guys are doing a great job with your work, kind of standardizing and defining what is MLOps, what does a stack look like, how are people doing this, across all these companies.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, which you talk about in Shipyard Part 2, I think it's one of the more interesting parts of your process, which is just to pull up my notes on it, it was how you guys use Git Ops, if I recall correctly, to basically manage the boarding pass, right? So for it seems like it's basically boarding pass is your process of using Git as a model registry almost, right? Like all your models are checked in through the boarding pass. There's this common information about every single model that's stored, and then you have this commit history that allows you to know, okay, what were the versions of the model? How are we doing on that version? Is that description correct? And how did you land on Git as the platform that you wanted to use for all of this work?
Yeah, so boarding pass is our tool. And again, I had too much fun naming it, but before a model can take flight, it needs to be onboarded through the boarding pass. So when you have a new project, a new model project idea, you'll use boarding pass to provision the GitLab repository for the code, the ECR registry for the container image, as well as, you know, a path in S3 for the model weights and data sets, and a couple other systems like Jira Service Management. We actually register a service so people can submit support tickets or report outages related to a particular model project. Just a couple other kind of metadata systems where you need to create a new model project, and all these systems kind of link together. So that's what the boarding pass does. One of the things it does do, like you mentioned, is actually it updates our environment manifest repositories. So when my coworker Amy joined a little over a year ago now, she built out our model promotion pipeline, which is articulated in part 3 of the Shipyard. But that's basically the piece of automation we support that tests, builds, and deploys and promotes machine learning model projects up through our different environments. And when it does that deployment and promotion, it's basically making a merge request against what we call an environment manifest repository. So every environment, dev, integration, staging, and production, has a GitLab repo. And the folder structure has basically an Argo CD app with Helm charts inside it to deploy that inference service. And when you want to promote a new version of a model to staging, for example, this model promotion pipeline opens up a merge request against that staging environment manifest repo, and it just changes the image tag to the new version, and it also updates the S3 model weights path to the newer, you know, timestamp version of the model weights. So we Git Ops is pretty central to how we do our deployments and maintain our different environments. That way we have a versioned history, like you said. We have the commit history of every time a change was made in the staging environment, every time a change was made in any of these environments, we know exactly when it happened. And we sort of have an audit trail back to the actual merge request that caused that change.
Two things stand out to me in your answer. One, you have a real commitment to using open source tools, Git, Helm, Argo, Kserve. Like throughout this podcast, it seems like there's a commitment to saying like, hey, we want to use what's open source and what's out there in the industry as opposed to just adopting a solution. And second, you know, philosophically, it seems that your team also has a real commitment to like abstracting away sort of operational burden, right? Which is the whole idea of MLOps, but like the way that you have thought about like using Jira, right? Like merging the practice of like deciding what to do with like what gets done and using all the tools that are available in terms of like project management, process management, and sort of like code management. It's pretty cool to see. And I'm wondering like, how did that like cultural emphasis come about? Is it that, you know, the team was kind of like, this is the way we want to build, or like has it been a couple developers that have pushed that? How did you get that perspective?
I think everyone's got experiences where they've been scarred by the fact that you can't do this thing because someone else needs to do it for you. So you need to open a ticket or email them and then wait. I don't want the ML engineers here to ever feel like that. They don't necessarily need to become certified Kubernetes admins to deploy something to Kubernetes. It's on us to build a tool that gives them that self-serve capability while also hopefully abstracting away any of the complexities that might stop them dead in their tracks. So I think it was just at the core, we want people to be able to do everything they need to do without waiting on us or us being a blocker to them.
That's so cool. I mean, Vishnu, you didn't mention too the other thing that stands out, which is the naming conventions you've got. I mean, these rival pancake stacks that I thought was my best name ever in the community, and you've got some incredible naming, boarding pass and snitch. It's hard to beat. But I'm wondering what when you're implementing something like this and you have this vision, what were some challenges that you came up against? What were some of the hard facts that you had to face up to?
Um, I think, and this may have changed. You guys have both mentioned that we trend towards building rather than buying. And when we buy, it's usually an open source solution like Kubeflow, where it's a kitchen sink of tools, but you have to wire them together. I think the fact that when this whole ML platform kicked off, we already had 15 models in production and we needed to create a new production environment for them. I think having those parameters and having that as a starting point sort of inspired the platform that we came up with. I know Amazon is big on this idea of be very frugal because it's just an additional constraint, and true creativity results when you have constraints that you have to work within. Um, I, I I think I believe that deeply inspired what we came up with, because otherwise it'd be entirely greenfield. I could pick, an off the shelf solution that has very strict mandates about, this is what your model looks like. You have to use one of these three machine learning frameworks. That was actually a big sort of architectural driver for the platform we have, is that our ML engineers, they use a myriad of frameworks, different versions of frameworks together to build a composite model. So one model may have, a PyTorch component. It may have a Hugging Face Transformers component and a Spacey component. We don't want to limit them or restrict them to, here's a base image with TensorFlow 2 and PyTorch 1.8. You have to build whatever you're going to build using these. So the fact that we had 15 models already built and you have to design a solution that supports these, I think that, building rather than buying was almost a necessity.
Yeah, having that constraint, I can see how that inspired you to kind of go with what works quickly. We don't have the lead time to say like, what are all the vendors? How do we figure out how to kind of, you know, uh, stage the implementation? Because actually at my company, we have the benefit of a clean slate right now. And as we're going through engineering our stack, we're kind of like, well, we can adopt what's, the best out there, right? And we can spend the time, standing things up, going through pricing negotiations and all those things to make sure that you can buy with the right level of effort. And I think for you guys, you probably didn't have that luxury. You had to kind of go from day one. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think you could say that. And I'm also curious, and I don't want to turn the interview around, but how do you two view kind of the space? I don't know. I'm sure you've seen MLOps.toys, but in my estimation, all of these sort of all-in-one out-of-the-box platforms, there are ones focused on NLP, or there are ones focused on structured data models and more traditional classifiers and regression problems. But it doesn't seem like there's a very compelling, like comprehensive, one-size-fits-all choice for supporting like these two different modalities.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. There's nothing I have seen that provides like, you know, end-to-end capabilities for multiple types of data
Mhm.
in a very elegant way, and if that doesn't exist, I think, given your use case, it made a lot of sense what you did. What do you think, Dimitrios?
Yeah, I was going to say this is the classic situation where someone who is a little earlier on in their journey, they're going to choose something that's going to get them to 0 to 1 really quickly. But then when they want to do that fine tuning and they get 80% there, but then that last 20%, like what you're talking about, where, oh, we need to try and use two data sources, or we need to try and do two totally separate things together. And that's where you hit the wall, and you need to start figuring out, how are we going to properly customize this to our use case. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons I want to talk to you was because I feel like a lot of people hit up against that wall, and they're trying to figure out right now, what do we do? How do we go about that? Because our 0 to 1 is good enough, but now we need to get to that next step, which is fine tuning that last 20%.
I think the other thing I would add here is that if you're an early stage company and you have a unique use case like what you're mentioning, right? Multiple types of data or just flexibility, you can bet on a vendor, right? You can bet on a vendor and you can kind of say like, hey, we want to work with this partner to like stand up the right kind of tool for our needs, and hopefully we get in early enough that we're on their roadmap, our feature requests are prioritized. But if you're not there, right, or if the industry isn't in that space, so I work in the healthcare field, right, like healthcare data right now, there's a huge movement towards like new vendors that are really prioritizing the needs of like startup companies like mine and saying like, hey, when your startup becomes huge, because your startup is the kind of company that we hope will be huge one day, our tool will grow with you. But if you don't have that, which I could see, and if you're in image and text, I think like it's a little bit harder right now. But if you're in video, I think it's possible. I think I've seen some interesting companies that are just coming out in video, kind of saying like, how can we build with companies that are going to explode as short form video and even long form video continue to explode? Streaming becomes the future.
I'm glad you mentioned that. This is kind of one of the first jobs where I actually have a say in if we want to buy something here, just make a justification for it, and
Yeah.
it can be considered in the budget. And it's been very weird to me. I don't know if this is standard for sort of vendoring or acquisitions or whatever you want to call it, procurement, but like account executives from these vendors who are selling these MLOps tools, like you said, they're also younger companies and they're very attuned to your needs and they want to get your feature requests on the roadmap. But it's a bit of a culture shock, because I'm used to, here's a tool, here's what it does, here's some pretty good documentation, like go heads down and build with it. Build what you need using these tools that are available. I guess that's sort of the GitHub mindset, open source mindset. But now it's sort of transitioning to, here's a tool that does something similar to what you may want to do. Help us define where it needs to go to actually fit your use case better, while also, supporting all the other users that could potentially want to use this product. I just want to call that out as something that's
and just
it
like
some
that,
adaptation.
You put a huge target on your back for everybody that is listening to this and trying to hit their sales quota. They're going to be reaching out to you to get you involved in the buying process. So hopefully you don't get too much unsolicited emails. But man, this has been awesome. I want to thank you for going through this. This was super cool to learn from you about how you are tackling some of these great challenges. It's really nice to see that you took this approach of like, hey, how can we go back to basics, and how can we make sure that we're not being the blocker for anyone and it seems like that fundamental question right there enabled so many decisions.
Yeah, it's nice to have that. I know I've used the term guiding light in these blog posts about the model flywheel. So that's, I think that's more architectural guidance or kind of in the weeds. Here's what we're building. But if you ever have something that you're uncertain about, it's nice to go back to, hey, what's best for the user? What makes them most productive? What makes them happiest?
Absolutely. I think, we talk a lot about ML platforms on this podcast. It's fair to say, right? And it's always interesting to see what different companies are doing and how they think about, the combination of people, process, technology to make that happen. And I think one of the things that stood out to me was like in your first post about the Shipyard, you described what you're trying to build as a model flywheel. And I was like, that's a thing that people have talked about, but the way that you put that in your first blog post and the way that that's mentioned up front, I think that's cool, because that's something anybody can get behind. Whether it's an engineer, whether it's a platform engineer, or whether it is a PM or a business stakeholder, an ops person, it makes a lot of sense when you say, hey, that's something that maximizes the value of the business. And I think that's what really allows us to be a lot more coherent than a lot of other sort of ML platform strategies that I've seen. So thank you so much for joining us, Joe. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.